The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Castle Thornhaven like a shroud as a lone figure approached the massive iron gates. He was unremarkable in every way, this newcomer, with his worn leather boots and simple homespun tunic that had seen better days. His dark hair fell across his eyes, and he kept his gaze lowered as he presented himself to the guard captain at the servants' entrance. His name, he said quietly, was Edmund, and he had come seeking work in the stables. The guard barely glanced at him before waving him through with a dismissive gesture, already forgetting his face before the young man had taken 3 steps into the courtyard. It was exactly what Edmund had intended. In a castle of over 300 souls, from nobles to kitchen maids, one more stable hand would vanish into the background like morning dew under the summer sun. No one would look twice at a boy who smelled of hay and horse sweat. No one would suspect that beneath those calloused hands and humble demeanor lay the most dangerous man in the kingdom. The head groom was a thick-necked man named Gareth, who ruled the stables with an iron fist and a tongue sharp enough to draw blood. He looked Edmund up and down with obvious disdain, taking in the youth's slender build and quiet manner. Without preamble, he thrust a pitchfork into Edmund's hands and pointed to the nearest stall, where a mountain of soiled straw awaited removal. The other stable hands, a rough collection of young men and boys who had grown hard from years of backbreaking labor, immediately sensed fresh meat for their amusement. They gathered like crows around carrion, their eyes glinting with malicious anticipation. The eldest among them, a broad-shouldered brute named Roderick, with a face like hammered leather, stepped forward first. He was known throughout the castle for his cruelty to those beneath him and his shameless flattery of those above. He circled Edmund slowly, his boots crunching on the straw-strewn floor, a predatory grin spreading across his scarred face. Roderick reached out and shoved Edmund's shoulder, testing him, pushing him back a step. The gathered stable hands laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the wooden beams above. Edmund said nothing, did not meet Roderick's eyes, simply steadied himself and gripped the pitchfork a little tighter. This only encouraged them further. Another boy, gap-toothed and mean-spirited, darted forward to kick straw at Edmund's legs, while a third made crude jokes about the new boy's soft hands and pretty face. They called him milksop and lordling, assuming from his clean speech that he must be some merchant's failed son, too proud for honest work, but too poor to avoid it. Gareth watched all this with folded arms and made no move to intervene, for in his philosophy, a stable boy who could not defend himself against mockery would never survive the hard work ahead. Edmund bore it all in silence, his face a mask of patient endurance, and set to work mucking out the stalls as though nothing had happened. But those who looked closely, and none of them did, might have seen something flicker in his grey eyes, something cold and calculating that belonged on a battlefield rather than in a stable. The days fell into a brutal rhythm. Edmund rose before dawn when the castle still slumbered in darkness, and he worked until long after the noble families had retired to their chambers. His hands, which had once wielded swords with deadly precision and penned orders that moved armies across the realm, now shoveled manure and hauled water from the well. His back, which had been straight as an oak in the war councils where he sat at the king's right hand, now bent beneath the weight of hay bales and saddles. The other stable hands took every opportunity to make his life miserable. They gave him the most dangerous horses to handle, the ones that bit and kicked without warning. They hid his tools so he would be punished for losing them. They poured water into his bedroll and loosened the straps on saddles he had prepared, hoping he would be blamed when a rider fell. Roderick was the worst of them all, a constant shadow of menace who seemed to live for the moments when he could humiliate the quiet new boy who never fought back. He would shoulder Edmund into walls, trip him when he carried buckets of water, and once even shoved his face toward a pile of fresh horse droppings, while the others howled with laughter. Through it all, Edmund remained silent and submissive, He apologized when they demanded it, kept his eyes down when they hurled insults, and never once raised his hand in his own defense. The stable hands interpreted this as weakness, as confirmation of everything they had suspected about this soft-spoken newcomer. They grew bolder, their torments more elaborate and cruel. What they could not know, what they could never have guessed, was that Edmund was not enduring their abuse out of weakness, but out of discipline forged in the fires of war. Every insult that rolled off him, every blow he absorbed without retaliation, was a choice made by a mind trained to think 10 steps ahead. He was not here to win fights in a stable. He was here for a purpose that none of them could fathom, a mission that required absolute secrecy and perfect concealment. The identity of the humble stable boy was a disguise so complete that even the king himself could pass through these stables and not recognize his most trusted commander. The man who had won 3 wars before his 30th year, the strategic genius known throughout the realm as the Ghost of Thornhaven. The castle above the stables was a place of intrigue and danger. King Aldric the Just ruled with wisdom and strength, but his court was infected with corruption that spread like rot through timber. There were traitors in his midst, nobles who smiled to his face while selling his secrets to enemy kingdoms. For months, the king's most sensitive information had leaked to his adversaries, costing lives and territory. Traditional investigations had failed. The traitors were too clever, too well protected by their positions and privileges. So the king had summoned his most trusted advisor, the man known in military circles as Commander Edmund Blackthorne, and together they had devised a desperate plan. Edmund would disappear from court, his absence explained as a secret diplomatic mission to distant lands. In truth, he would infiltrate his own castle at its lowest level, becoming invisible among the servants who saw and heard everything, but were themselves never seen or heard by the nobles. From this position, Edmund would observe, listen, and slowly unravel the conspiracy that threatened the kingdom. It was dangerous work, for if his identity were discovered by the wrong people, he would be killed before he could cry out for help. But Edmund had not earned his reputation by choosing safe paths. 6 weeks into his service in the stables, Edmund had begun to piece together valuable information. Servants gossiped endlessly, and they moved through the castle like ghosts, present in every room yet invisible to the nobles who discussed sensitive matters in their presence. Edmund listened to the kitchen maids who served the private dinners of suspected conspirators. He befriended the laundry women who handled the nobles' clothing and sometimes found notes in pockets. He made himself useful to the pages and squires who ran messages throughout the castle, offering to help them with their duties in exchange for casual conversation about their master's moods and movements. Slowly, a pattern emerged. 3 nobles in particular seemed to be at the center of the web. Lord Ravencroft, a wealthy merchant turned nobleman with extensive foreign connections. Lady Marissa Blackwood, whose late husband had left her with vast estates and a hungry ambition, and Sir Thornton Greymark, the king's own master of coin, whose position gave him access to the kingdom's most sensitive financial and military information. But Edmund needed proof, and proof was difficult to obtain from a stable. His opportunity came unexpectedly on a wet autumn evening. Roderick and his gang of tormentors had cornered Edmund in the tackroom after the day's work was done. They were drunk on ale stolen from the castle stores, their cruelty amplified by alcohol and boredom. Roderick grabbed Edmund by his tunic and slammed him against the wall, hard enough to rattle the bridles hanging from their hooks. The other boys formed a semicircle, blocking any escape, their faces flushed and eager. Roderick's breath was hot and foul as he leaned close, demanding that Edmund get on his knees and beg for mercy, that he admit he was nothing but a worthless coward who did not deserve to work in the king's stables. For the first time since his arrival, Edmund felt his carefully maintained control begin to slip. His hands, which had been slack at his sides, slowly curled into fists. His jaw tightened, the part of him that was Commander Blackthorne, the part that had led cavalry charges and broken enemy lines, stirred like a sleeping dragon, awakened by the scent of blood. It would be so easy to end this, to show these ignorant boys what happened when you pushed a trained warrior too far. One strike to Roderick's throat would drop him. A kick to the knee of the boy on his left would shatter bone. 3 seconds, perhaps 4, and he could paint these walls with their suffering. But then a voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. It came from the doorway, cold and commanding, belonging to someone accustomed to instant obedience. The stable hands whirled around to find themselves facing Captain Marcus Stonebridge, commander of the Castle Guard and one of the few men in the kingdom who knew Edmund's true identity. Marcus was a granite mountain of a man, his face scarred from decades of battle, his grey beard braided in the military fashion. His hand rested casually on the pommel of his sword, but there was nothing casual about the look in his eyes. He ordered the stable hands to disperse immediately, his tone making it clear that disobedience would result in consequences they would regret for the rest of their short lives. Roderick opened his mouth to protest, to explain that they were just having a bit of fun with the new boy, but something in Marcus's expression made the words die in his throat. The stable hands scattered like roaches exposed to light, leaving Edmund alone with the captain in the shadowy tack room. Marcus said nothing for a long moment, just studied Edmund with eyes that had seen too many wars and buried too many friends. Then, so quietly that no one outside the room could possibly hear, he spoke a single word that was not a question, but an observation. "Commander?" Edmund straightened slightly, allowing just a fraction of his true bearing to show through the submissive posture he had maintained for weeks. Marcus continued in that same careful whisper, informing him that the king required his presence in 1 hour at the old chapel in the East Wing, the one that had been sealed after the fire 10 years ago. It was a place where they could meet without suspicion, for no servant would venture there after dark, and no noble had reason to visit a burned-out ruin. Edmund nodded once, and Marcus departed without another word, leaving the stable boy alone with his thoughts and the smell of leather and horse sweat. Edmund allowed himself a moment to simply breathe, to release the tension that had coiled in his muscles like a compressed spring. Then he returned to his work, for he still had stalls to clean before he could slip away into the night. The old chapel was a shell of its former glory, its roof open to the stars, and its walls blackened by ancient flames. King Aldric was already there when Edmund arrived, standing in what had once been the nave, his royal cloak pulled tight against the autumn chill. The king was a man in his late 50s, his beard more silver than gold now, but his eyes were still sharp and his mind sharper still. He embraced Edmund like the friend he was, not the servant he pretended to be, and for a moment they were just two men who had survived many dangers together. But the moment passed quickly, for the situation had grown dire. The king explained in an urgent whisper that another leak had occurred 3 days ago, information about troop movements that had resulted in an ambush on one of his supply convoys. 12 good men had died because someone in this castle had sold them out. The traitors were growing bolder, more confident. They had to be exposed soon, before the damage became irreparable. Edmund reported what he had learned. The pattern of meetings between the 3 suspects, the foreign merchants who seemed to visit Lord Ravencroft with unusual frequency, the coded letters that a chambermaid had mentioned seeing in Lady Blackwood's chambers. But it was not enough for arrests, not nearly enough to move against nobles of such standing. They needed something concrete, something undeniable. The king had an idea, dangerous but potentially decisive. In 3 days, he would hold a private council meeting in his chambers, attended only by his most trusted advisers and the 3 suspected traitors. He would deliberately introduce false information during this meeting, 3 different pieces of sensitive intelligence, each shared with only one of the suspects in private conversation. They would then watch to see which piece of information leaked to their enemies. It was a classic trap, one that Edmund himself had suggested months ago, but the timing had never been right until now. The plan would work, Edmund agreed, but someone would need to be positioned to observe and intercept any messages that left the castle after the meeting. This was where Edmund's position in the stables became crucial. Nobles did not carry their own treasonous messages to enemy agents. They used servants, messengers, people who could move freely without suspicion. And those people often passed through the stables when their errands required horses or when they used the servant passages that connected there. Edmund would watch, and he would be ready. The 2 men clasped hands, a warrior's grip that spoke of mutual respect and shared danger. And then the king melted back into the shadows, leaving his commander alone once more in the ruins. The next 3 days were among the longest of Edmund's life. He continued his work in the stables, continued to endure the mockery and abuse of Roderick and the others, but now every sense was heightened, every moment stretched taut with anticipation. He positioned himself strategically, taking on tasks that gave him reasons to be in different parts of the stable complex at different times, creating patterns that would not seem unusual when he needed to be in exactly the right place. He befriended a nervous young page boy named Thomas, who served in the nobles' quarters, learning from him the layout of the private chambers and the routines of the suspected traitors. He memorized the faces of every messenger and servant who regularly left the castle on errands, and he waited patient as a hunter in a blind for the trap to spring. Roderick seemed to sense something different about Edmund during these days, some quality he could not quite name that made the stable boy seem less like prey and more like something else entirely. The abuse lessened slightly, though Roderick covered this with claims that he was simply bored of tormenting someone who never fought back. But sometimes Edmund would catch the bigger man watching him with narrowed eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle he had not known existed. The day of the council meeting arrived grey and cold, with rain threatening from low-hanging clouds. Edmund was assigned to the afternoon duty of exercising the nobles' horses in the castle yard, a task that kept him visible and apparently occupied while actually giving him a perfect vantage point to observe the comings and goings from the main keep. He walked the horses in careful circles, brushing them, checking their hooves, all the while watching the doors and windows above. The council meeting would be taking place now, in the king's private solar. The trap was being set. Hours passed. The threatened rain began to fall, first as a mist and then as a steady drizzle that dampened Edmund's rough tunic and made the cobblestones slick. Still he worked, giving no sign that he was anything other than a diligent stable boy performing his duties. And then, just as the church bells rang for vespers, he saw what he had been waiting for. A side door opened and a figure emerged, moving quickly despite the rain, cloak pulled up to hide his face. But Edmund recognized the gait, the build. It was Lord Ravencroft's personal secretary, a weasel-faced man named Peter, who had a reputation for absolute loyalty to his master and absolute discretion in all matters. Peter moved toward the stables, and Edmund's pulse quickened, though his face remained calm. The secretary entered through the main doors, nodded curtly to Gareth, who was supervising from his office, and then moved toward the rear of the building where the private messenger stalls were kept. Edmund abandoned his current task as naturally as possible, leading his horse back to its stall, moving with deliberate casualness in the same direction. He arrived just in time to see Petter speaking in low tones to one of the stable's professional messengers, a hard-eyed man named Corwin, who was known to ride fast and ask no questions if the pay was right. Petter handed over a sealed letter, along with a purse that clinked with the weight of gold. The destination was to be the Grey Boar Inn, 15 miles south on the border road, where the letter should be delivered to a merchant named Sartos. Corwin nodded, pocketed both letter and purse, and moved to prepare his horse. Petyr departed the way he had come, never once glancing at the humble stable boy who mucked stalls nearby, never imagining that he had just been witnessed by the king's most dangerous operative. Edmund waited until Corwin had ridden out of the castle gates before he made his move. He crossed quickly to Gareth's office, adopting an expression of confused worry, and reported that the Earl of Westmarch's stallion was showing signs of lameness, and he thought it might be serious. Gareth, who lived in terror of any harm coming to the noble's valuable horses, rushed off to examine the animal, leaving the office temporarily empty. Edmund slipped inside and borrowed one of the fast horses that Gareth kept for emergency use, signing it out in the log as being needed for a vital errand to the castle blacksmith's village workshop. No one questioned him. He was just a stable boy after all, beneath notice and suspicion. Within 5 minutes, he was through the gates and riding hard down the southern road, the rain now falling in sheets that reduced visibility, but would also help conceal his pursuit. Corwin had a head start, but Edmund knew these roads far better than any messenger, had ridden them in war and peace, and he knew exactly where he could make up time. He caught up to Corwin an hour later, just as true darkness was falling. The messenger had slowed his pace, confident that no one was following, eager to preserve his horse for the long night ride ahead. Edmund followed at a careful distance, close enough to keep Corwin in sight, but far enough back that the sound of his horse's hooves blended with the rain and wind. They were in wild country now, miles from any village, riding through forest that pressed close on either side of the muddy road. It was perfect terrain for what Edmund had to do. He urged his horse forward, closing the gap, his mind already calculating angles and possibilities. Corwin heard him coming at the last moment, turned in his saddle with a shout of surprise and alarm, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. But Edmund was already moving, had been moving before Corwin even registered the threat. He drove his horse alongside the messenger's mount, reached out with one strong hand, and seized Corwin by the collar of his cloak. The messenger tried to draw his knife, tried to pull away, but Edmund's grip was iron, and his horsemanship was flawless. With a sharp yank, he pulled Corwin from the saddle, both men tumbling to the muddy ground in a tangle of limbs and cloaks. They rolled apart and came up facing each other, both soaked and filthy, both breathing hard. Corwin had his knife out now, a wicked curved blade that glinted in the faint light of the rising moon. He circled Edmund warily, clearly puzzled by this attack from what he assumed was just another stable hand, perhaps a thief hoping for an easy score. He lunged, the knife flashing toward Edmund's belly in a practiced killing stroke, but Edmund was not there when the blade arrived. He had moved with a speed and precision that made Corwin's attack look clumsy by comparison, sidestepping and catching the messenger's wrist mid-strike. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Edmund twisted Corwin's arm in a joint lock that he had learned from Eastern warriors during his campaigns abroad, forcing the knife to drop from nerveless fingers. He swept Corwin's legs with a kick that sent the man crashing down onto his back in the mud, and then Edmund was on top of him, one knee on his chest, one hand around his throat, applying just enough pressure to make breathing difficult, but not impossible. Corwin stared up in shock and terror, no longer seeing a simple stable boy, but something else entirely, something trained and deadly that looked at him with cold professional assessment. Edmund spoke quietly, his voice calm despite the violence of the moment, and asked Corwin a simple question. He could answer and live, or refuse and die here in the mud where no one would find his body for days. The choice was his. Corwin, no fool despite his profession, chose life. Between gasps for air, he confirmed what Edmund had suspected. He had carried letters for Lord Ravencroft before, letters to this same contact at the Grey Boar Inn, always paid generously to ask no questions and forget what he had seen. He did not know what was in the letters, truly did not, and had never tried to find out. Edmund believed him. He released the pressure on Corwin's throat slightly and reached into the messenger's coat, finding the sealed letter exactly where he had seen Peter place it. The seal was Lord Ravenscroft's personal mark, a raven clutching a sword. Edmund broke it without hesitation and read the contents by the dim moonlight, his eyes moving rapidly over the page. His expression remained neutral, but inside, triumph blazed like a beacon. The letter contained detailed information about the false intelligence the king had shared with Ravenscroft during the private council meeting. Information about a supposed weakness in the northern border defenses that did not actually exist. It was exactly the proof they needed, and it confirmed that Lord Ravenscroft was indeed the traitor, or at least one of them. Edmund made a decision. He could not let this letter reach its intended recipient, as that would alert the traitors that their scheme had been discovered. But he also could not simply disappear with it, as Corwin's failure to complete his delivery would raise questions. He needed Corwin to return to the castle, to report success, to keep the conspirators feeling safe for just a little while longer. So Edmund did something that surprised even himself. He told Corwin part of the truth. He explained that he was not really a stable boy, but an agent of the king, that Lord Ravenscroft was under investigation for treason, and that Corwin had just become an accessory to that treason by carrying this letter. The penalty for such a crime was death, slow and public, but Edmund offered an alternative. Corwin would return to the castle and report that the letter had been successfully delivered. He would continue to accept any further commissions from Ravenscroft or his secretary, but he would immediately report them to Edmund. In exchange, when the conspiracy was finally broken and the traitors arrested, Corwin would be granted immunity and allowed to leave the kingdom with his life and a small purse to start over elsewhere. Corwin agreed instantly, desperately, his eyes showing he understood that this was not really a negotiation, but a merciful reprieve from execution. They staged the scene carefully. Edmund gave Corwin a purse of coins equal to what he would have received at the Grey Boar Inn, to match the weight in his pocket. They agreed on the details of the fictional delivery, the description of the contact, the words exchanged. And then Edmund helped the shaken messenger back onto his horse and sent him back toward Castle Thornhaven, with instructions to report to Edmund's sleeping quarters in the stable after he had made his report to Peter. Edmund himself took a different route back, a hunter's path through the forest that would bring him to the castle walls, far from the main gate. He climbed over using handholds he had scouted during his first weeks in the stable, moving through the darkness like the ghost his military nickname suggested. By the time he had rubbed down his borrowed horse and returned it to Gareth's stock, it was as if he had never left. The head groom was still fussing over the Earl's stallion, which Edmund had carefully ensured showed no signs of actual lameness, and no one had marked his absence as unusual. He was just a stable boy, after all, present and invisible in equal measure. Corwin appeared at Edmund's quarters 2 hours later, after the castle had settled into its nighttime rhythms. He reported in whispers that Petter had been pleased with his success and had hinted that more deliveries might be needed in the coming weeks. Edmund nodded, satisfied, and Corwin slipped away into the night, looking like a man who had seen death reach for him and somehow been given another chance at life. Edmund lay on his thin straw mattress in the stable hand's sleeping loft and studied the stolen letter by candlelight. The contents were damning, but they were also revealing in ways that went beyond the immediate treason. The letter referenced previous communications, suggested the existence of other conspirators, and mentioned a timeline for some larger plan that was apparently nearing completion. The conspiracy was bigger than they had thought, and more urgent. Edmund needed to get this information to the king immediately, but it was deep night now, and any meeting would be risky. He would have to wait for morning, for the routine that would allow him to slip away without notice. Sleep did not come easily that night. His mind churned with possibilities and plans, with the weight of knowledge that lives depended on his next moves. Above him in the loft, Roderick and the other stable hands snored in various states of drunken oblivion, none of them imagining that the quiet boy in the corner bunk held the fate of kingdoms in his calloused hands. Morning came grey and cold. Edmund performed his duties with mechanical efficiency, his mind elsewhere, counting the minutes until he could safely slip away. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As he was hauling water from the well, Roderick appeared with a gang of his cronies, all of them in particularly foul moods. They had been disciplined by Gareth for some infraction Edmund had not witnessed, and they blamed him, reasoning in their simple way that everything had gone wrong since the new boy had arrived. Roderick grabbed the yoke from Edmund's shoulders, spilling the water buckets, and shoved him hard against the stone wall of the well house. His face was inches from Edmund's, his breath stinking of sour ale, his eyes red-rimmed and mean. He announced that he was tired of Edmund's presence, tired of his quiet acceptance, tired of his very existence. Today, Edmund would fight back, or he would be beaten so badly that he would have to leave the castle to recover, one way or another. The gathered stable hands formed a circle, trapping Edmund, their expressions eager for violence. Edmund knew he could not afford this, not now, not when everything was so close to completion, but he also knew that sometimes the only way out was through. He tried words first, keeping his voice level and submissive, suggesting that they could settle this later, that Gareth would be angry if they caused a disruption. But Roderick was beyond reason, wound up by his own humiliation and drunk on the power of the mob at his back. He threw the first punch, a haymaker aimed at Edmund's face with enough force to break bones, and Edmund, despite every instinct screaming at him to maintain his cover, could not let it land. Years of training took over. He slipped the punch with minimal movement, just enough to let Roderick's fist whistle past his ear and crash into the stone wall behind him. The impact was sickening. Roderick howled and stumbled back, clutching his shattered knuckles, staring at his hand in disbelief. The gathered stable hands went silent, shock rippling through them. The quiet stable boy, who never fought back, had just made Roderick, the toughest man in the stables, look like a clumsy amateur. Before anyone could fully process what had happened, two more of Roderick's friends rushed forward, one from each side. Edmund moved without thinking, his body executing techniques drilled into him through 10,000 repetitions on training grounds and battlefields. He ducked under one attacker's grab, used the man's own momentum to throw him into his companion, and both went down in a heap. The circle broke. The remaining stable hands backed away, their courage evaporating as they suddenly realized they had no idea who or what they were actually facing. Edmund stood in the center of the space they had created, breathing hard, his carefully maintained disguise in tatters. Roderick was on his knees, cradling his ruined hand, tears of pain and rage streaming down his face. He looked up at Edmund with an expression that mixed fear and hatred in equal measure, and he did something Edmund had not expected. He started shouting for the guards, screaming that he had been attacked, that this stable boy was dangerous, that he needed to be arrested. Edmund knew he had mere seconds before this situation spiraled completely out of control. He grabbed Roderick by his shirt and pulled him close, and for the first time since arriving at Castle Thornhaven, he allowed his full authority to show in his voice. He told Roderick to be silent, to go to the infirmary and have his hand treated, and to forget this had ever happened. The command in his tone was absolute, the voice of someone who had ordered men into battle and expected instant obedience. Roderick fell silent, stunned, his mouth hanging open, but the damage was done. The guards had heard the commotion and were already approaching, led by none other than Captain Marcus Stonebridge. Marcus took in the scene with one experienced glance. The injured Roderick, the scattered stable hands, and Edmund standing in the center, looking far more like a warrior than a servant. His face remained carefully neutral, but Edmund saw the flash of concern in his eyes. This was a disaster. The exposure of Edmund's fighting skills would lead to questions, investigations, a tension that could unravel everything they had worked for. Marcus ordered everyone to disperse, told them this was a matter for the castle guard to handle. The stable hands scattered gratefully, wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. Roderick was helped away by 2 guards, still muttering threats and promises of revenge through his pain. And then Edmund and Marcus were alone in the stable yard, the captain studying his king's hidden commander with an expression that spoke volumes about the precariousness of their situation. They could not talk here, not openly, but Marcus's hand signals were clear. They would meet at the old chapel again in 1 hour, and Edmund had better have a very good explanation for what had just happened. Edmund used the intervening time to clean himself up and collect the stolen letter from its hiding place beneath his mattress. His mind raced through possible solutions to the problem he had created. Word would spread through the castle about the stable boy who could fight. Questions would be asked. His cover, which had been so carefully constructed, was compromised even if not completely blown. When he reached the burned chapel, he found both Marcus and King Aldric waiting for him, the king's presence indicating just how serious the situation had become. Aldric's face was drawn with worry, but he listened without interruption as Edmund reported everything. The intercepted letter, his confrontation with Corwin, the proof of Ravencroft's treason, and finally this morning's disastrous fight in the stable yard. The king read the letter himself by the grey morning light filtering through the broken roof, and Edmund saw the anger kindle in his eyes as he absorbed the full extent of the betrayal. But when Aldric looked up, his first concern was for his commander's safety. They had their proof, or at least part of it. Perhaps it was time to end the masquerade before Edmund's exposed fighting skills led the traitors to identify him. But Edmund argued against this. Yes, his cover was compromised but not completely destroyed. A stable boy who could fight was unusual but not impossible. There were men from all walks of life who ended up in menial positions, soldiers who had lost their positions, guards who had fallen into disgrace, even minor nobles who had squandered their inheritances. He could claim to be any of these things if pressed, could say he had hidden his skills out of a desire to avoid notice and trouble. What was crucial was that the letter mentioned other conspirators and a timeline. If they arrested Ravencroft now based solely on this letter, the others would scatter like rats from a burning barn. They needed to know the full extent of the conspiracy, needed to roll up the entire network at once. Edmund proposed a bold plan. He would allow himself to be promoted from the stables to a position as a guard recruit, using the fighting skills he had just revealed as his qualification. This would give him access to different parts of the castle, allow him to interact with people who would never speak freely around a stable boy. Corwin would continue to report on any messages Ravencroft tried to send. And they would wait, watch, and gather evidence until they could strike at all the traitors simultaneously. It was risky, perhaps too risky, but the alternative was to accept a partial victory that might save the kingdom today, but leave it vulnerable tomorrow. King Aldric considered this for a long moment, his hand stroking his beard, his eyes distant with thought. Marcus argued against it, pointing out that every day Edmund remained in this exposed position was a day he could be identified and killed. But the king knew his commander's mind, knew that once Edmund Blackthorne committed to a course of action, he would see it through or die trying. Finally, Aldric nodded. They would proceed with Edmund's plan, but with modifications. Marcus would personally oversee Edmund's recruitment into the Guard, would ensure he was assigned to duties that maximized his intelligence-gathering potential while minimizing his exposure to the traitors themselves, and they would set a deadline. If they did not have actionable intelligence on the full conspiracy within 2 weeks, they would act on what they had and accept the consequences. It was a compromise, but it was the best they could hope for given the circumstances. The three men clasped hands, a warrior's pact in a burned ruin, and then separated to play their parts. Edmund returned to the stables to collect his meagre belongings, while Marcus went to inform Gareth that the stable boy with the surprising combat skills was being transferred to the guard, effective immediately. The next 2 weeks were the most intense of Edmund's life. As a new guard recruit, he was assigned to various duties throughout the castle, each chosen by Marcus to put him in positions where he could observe the suspected traitors without directly interacting with them. He stood watch outside council chambers, overhearing fragments of conversations. He patrolled corridors late at night, noting which nobles met secretly in supposedly empty rooms. He befriended other guards and servants, building a network of information sources throughout the castle, and slowly, painfully, the picture came together. Lord Ravencroft was indeed at the center of the conspiracy, but he was not alone. Lady Blackwood and Sir Greymark were both involved, along with at least 3 other minor nobles. They were working with agents from the neighboring kingdom of Valdoria, selling military intelligence in exchange for gold and promises of lands and titles once the current king was overthrown. The timeline the letter had referenced became clearer. They were planning to act during the king's upcoming tour of the Northern Territories, which was scheduled to begin in 10 days. While Aldrich was away from the castle with most of his loyal guards, the conspirators would stage a coup, claiming that the king had been killed by bandits and declaring Lady Blackwood's young son, who was distantly related to the royal line, as his successor. Edmund compiled all of this information meticulously, cross-referencing every source, verifying every detail. He continued to receive reports from Corwin about additional letters, though Ravencroft seemed to have grown more cautious after the first successful delivery, using multiple couriers and varying his methods. On the 12th day of his time in the Guard, Edmund finally had what he needed. Names, dates, methods, and most importantly, documented proof in the form of intercepted correspondence and witness testimony from servants who had unwittingly aided the conspiracy. He presented all of this to the king and Marcus in a late-night meeting in Aldrich's private chambers, laying out the evidence like pieces on a game board. The king's face grew darker with each revelation, not just at the scope of the betrayal, but at how close they had come to disaster. If Edmund had not uncovered this plot, if he had not been willing to endure weeks of humiliation and danger in the castle's depths, the kingdom would have fallen from within. It was time to act, they all agreed. But the arrests had to be coordinated perfectly. If even one of the conspirators escaped or got word to their Valdorian contacts, it could trigger the very crisis they were trying to prevent. The arrests were planned for the night before the king's scheduled departure for his northern tour. This timing was deliberate, as the conspirators would be relaxed, confident that their plan was about to unfold. Marcus assembled a force of his most trusted men, guards whose loyalty had been tested over years of service. Edmund insisted on being part of the arrest team, despite the risk that his true identity might finally be revealed. He had earned the right to see this through to the end. They struck at midnight when the castle slept. Teams of guards moved simultaneously to 7 different locations, arresting the conspirators in their beds before they could flee or destroy evidence. Lord Ravencroft was taken in his chambers, still dressed in his nightclothes, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. Lady Blackwood was arrested in her tower rooms, where they found a cache of coded letters and Valdorian gold coins hidden beneath a loose flagstone. Sir Greymark, the king's own master of coin, tried to resist and was subdued with minimal force, Edmund himself delivering the blow that sent the traitor crashing to the floor. By dawn, all 7 conspirators were in the castle's deepest cells, and their Valdorian contacts in the city had been rounded up by the city guard. The revelation of the conspiracy sent shockwaves through the kingdom. King Aldric convened a public trial in the castle's great hall, presenting the evidence that Edmund had gathered to an assembly of nobles, clergy, and common citizens. The testimony of servants who had been used unwittingly by the conspirators was particularly damning, as were the intercepted letters with their seals and signatures. The traitors had no defense against such overwhelming proof. They were found guilty of high treason, and their lands and titles were stripped from them. The sentences were carried out within a week, and Edmund, who had seen many men die in war, found no satisfaction in these deaths, but rather a grim sense of duty fulfilled. The kingdom was safe, at least for now. The conspiracy had been ended before it could bear its poisoned fruit, and the king had demonstrated to both his people and his enemies that treachery would be discovered and punished, no matter how well hidden or how highly placed the traitors. In the aftermath, Aldric offered Edmund any reward he wished, any title or land or treasure, but Edmund asked for only one thing: to remain as he was, as the king's hidden blade, the commander who worked in shadows so that the kingdom could stand in light. The story of what had happened spread through the castle like wildfire, though the full truth was known to only a few. The servants whispered about the guard who had been instrumental in uncovering the conspiracy, though they did not know his name. The nobles speculated about how the king had learned of the plot, some guessing at spies and agents, but none imagining the truth. And in the stables, where Edmund had spent those long weeks in disguise, the remaining stable hands spoke in awed tones about the quiet boy who had endured their mockery and abuse, who had turned out to be something far more than he appeared. Roderick, his hand healed but permanently crooked from the break, left the castle's service entirely, too ashamed to remain after his treatment of someone who had been working to save the kingdom. Gareth, the head groom, was heard to remark that he had suspected something unusual about Edmund from the start, though everyone who remembered those days knew this was a lie. The truth was that Edmund had been invisible to them, and that invisibility had been his greatest weapon. Edmund did not return to his public role as Commander Blackthorn immediately. With the king's blessing, he remained in his position as a simple guard for several more months, ostensibly to ensure that no other conspiracies were brewing in the conspiracy's wake. But in reality, he had discovered something during his time in disguise, something that made him reluctant to return to the pomp and formality of the command structure. He had learned that power and influence existed at every level of the kingdom, that the servants and common soldiers often knew more about what truly happened in the castle than the nobles who supposedly ruled it. He had learned humility through humiliation, patience through provocation, and the value of seeing the world from the bottom looking up rather than from the top looking down. These lessons, he knew, would make him a better commander, a better advisor to the king, and a better servant of the realm. When he finally did resume his public identity, appearing at a council meeting in his commander's uniform, to the shock and amazement of those nobles who had not been privy to the secret, he was a changed man, still brilliant, still dangerous when needed, but tempered by experiences that no amount of battlefield glory could have provided. The tale of the stable boy, who was secretly the king's hidden commander, became legend in time, told and retold until the details blurred and the truth became indistinguishable from myth. Some versions said he had been a prince in disguise, others that he was a wizard who had used magic to conceal his identity. But those who had been there, who had known the truth, understood that the real story was both simpler and more profound. Edmund Blackthorn had demonstrated that true strength did not always announce itself with trumpets and banners, that the greatest warriors sometimes fought battles that involved no swords, and that service to the kingdom could take many forms, some humble and hidden from glory. He continued to serve King Aldric for many years after, leading armies when war threatened and working in shadows when shadows were needed. But he never forgot those weeks in the stables, never forgot what it felt like to be invisible and powerless, to be mocked and abused by those who thought him beneath them. Those memories kept him grounded when others might have grown proud, kept him connected to the common people of the kingdom when others might have drifted into the isolation of the elite. In the end, the greatest lesson of Edmund's time in disguise was not about spycraft or intelligence gathering, though those skills had certainly saved the kingdom. It was about the fundamental truth that every person, regardless of their station or appearance, carries within them depths that are invisible to casual observation. The stable hands who had tormented Edmund had seen only what they expected to see, a weak boy who accepted abuse without protest. They had failed to imagine that strength could wear the mask of submission, that power could choose invisibility, that the greatest warrior in the kingdom might voluntarily clean stalls and haul water in service of a higher purpose. Their failure of imagination, their inability to see beyond surface appearances, was a failure that existed throughout society, Edmund realized. How many other people were overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed simply because they did not broadcast their capabilities or demand attention? How much potential went unrealized because society had decided, based on superficial factors, who was worthy of respect and who was not? These questions stayed with Edmund for the rest of his life, influencing how he treated the soldiers under his command, the servants in his household, and every person he encountered, regardless of their rank or station. Years later, when Edmund was an old man and King Aldric had been succeeded by his son, young guards would sometimes ask the legendary commander about his greatest battle or his most daring military campaign. Edmund would smile at these questions, his eyes distant with memory, and he would tell them about the time he went to war, armed with nothing but a pitchfork and a horsebrush, about how he fought his hardest battles without ever raising his fist in anger, and about how he won his greatest victory by learning to see the world through the eyes of those whom the powerful never noticed. Some of the young guards understood what he was trying to teach them, while others simply thought the old man's memories had grown confused with age. But those who did understand, those who grasped the deeper truth in his words, went on to become the kingdom's finest officers and most trusted advisors, for they had learned the lesson that Edmund had paid such a high price to master, that true wisdom requires the humility to recognize that you do not have all the answers, that the person you overlook today might be the one who saves your life tomorrow, and that the measure of a man is not found in the glory others see, but in the character he maintains when he believes no one is watching. The old stable building where Edmund had spent those transformative weeks still stands at Castle Thornhaven, though it has been rebuilt and modernized over the decades. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the evening when the horses are settled and the stable hands are finishing their chores, one of the older workers will gather the younger ones and tell them the story of Commander Blackthorn and his time among them. The story has grown in the telling, embellished with details that may or may not be true, but its core message remains unchanged. Treat everyone with respect, the old workers say, for you never know who might be standing before you in disguise. That quiet person mucking stalls beside you might be a warrior, a scholar, a king, or a commander. Or they might simply be a person doing honest work, trying to get through their day, and they deserve your respect, regardless of whether they turn out to be secretly remarkable. Because every person is remarkable in their own way, if you have the wisdom to look beyond surfaces and the compassion to care about what you find there. And so the legend of the stable boy, who was really the king's hidden commander, continues to teach its lessons to new generations, reminding them that power wielded with humility is more effective than power wielded with pride, that service comes in many forms, both great and small, and that the truest measure of a person's character is revealed not in moments of glory, but in the quiet dignity, which they face hardship and injustice. Edmund Blackthorn, who had once been the most powerful military commander in the kingdom and had voluntarily become its most humble stable boy, understood this truth better than anyone. He had descended from the heights of power to the depths of servitude, and in doing so, he had climbed to a level of wisdom that few ever reach. He had learned that the view from the bottom looking up reveals truths that remain forever hidden from the view at the top looking down, and that knowledge had made him not just a better commander, but a better man. It was a lesson worth any price, worth any humiliation, worth any sacrifice, and it was a lesson that, in the end, saved not just a kingdom, but the soul of the man who learned it. Thank you for listening to this tale from the medieval world. If you enjoyed this story of Edmund Blackthorne and his time as the Hidden Commander, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more epic medieval stories. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us, what would you have done in Edmund's position? Would you have been able to endure weeks of mockery and abuse while maintaining your cover, or would you have revealed your true identity? Have you ever had an experience where someone completely underestimated you, or where you discovered that someone you overlooked was far more capable than you imagined? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you these tales of courage, wisdom, and adventure from the medieval era. Until next time, may you always remember to look beyond surfaces and treat everyone with the respect they deserve, for you never know who might be standing before you in disguise.